Marissa Cole had never been the type to invite trouble, nor did she go looking for it. After her husband passed away 5 years earlier, she had chosen a small, 2-story home on the quieter edge of a suburban neighborhood, a place where the streets wound lazily between rows of modest houses, each with their own patches of lawn and small gardens. Her property sat at the very end of a cul-de-sac, where her backyard fence pressed up against a narrow strip of unused land that technically belonged to the neighborhood's communal grounds. It wasn't much to look at, just a stretch of overgrown grass dotted with a few scraggly trees, but to Marissa it was part of the charm. It gave her a buffer from the world, an illusion of privacy that she valued more than anything. She filled her yard with flowering shrubs and a carefully tended vegetable garden, spending quiet mornings pulling weeds with the radio humming softly from an open kitchen window. Life here was predictable, and Marissa liked it that way. The most excitement she had seen in months was when a squirrel chewed through the wiring of her garden lights, and even that she had fixed without fuss. She had no desire to get involved in neighborhood gossip or petty disputes. She nodded politely when she saw neighbors walking their dogs, occasionally accepted an invitation to a block barbecue, but kept her social engagements light and her circle small. It wasn't that she was unfriendly. She simply preferred her own company and the tranquility of her routines. That tranquility, however, had one persistent crack in its surface, and her name was Karen Jones. Karen lived 3 houses down, a tall, sharp-eyed woman in her early 60s who always seemed to have a clipboard under one arm and a reason to stop the people on the street. Karen was the sort who made it her business to know everything about everyone, who had painted their house, who left their trash bin out too long, who failed to trim their hedges, and she wielded that knowledge like a tool. From the very first week Marissa had moved in, Karen had appeared at her door with a broad, too-wide smile and a comment about how lucky Marissa was to have such a nice spot near the green strip, followed by an oddly specific question about whether she had considered making better use of that space. Marissa had brushed it off at the time, chalking it up to idle conversation. But over the years, she noticed a pattern. Whenever that strip of land came up in conversation, Karen's eyes would flick toward it with a calculating glint, as though she was measuring it for something. In the last month, those glances had turned into activity. Marissa had seen Karen out there with a couple of men from the neighborhood, pacing back and forth along the fence line, gesturing toward the trees, sometimes poking at the ground with a stick. On one occasion, she saw them unloading a pickup truck full of wooden pallets and stacked logs, leaving them in a haphazard pile not far from her fence. It was odd enough to catch Marissa's attention, though she told herself it was probably part of some community project. Still, a small seed of unease had taken root. The unease deepened one Thursday evening when Marissa stepped out to water her tomatoes and noticed the pile of pallets had doubled in size. Alongside them lay a collection of what looked like scrap lumber, brittle and splintered, clearly pulled from some demolition project. There were also a few large metal drums, their sides streaked with rust and blackened in spots. She stared at them for a long moment, her mind flicking through the possible explanations, none of which made her feel any better. When she glanced toward the end of the street, she saw Karen standing with one of the men, both of them looking in her direction. Karen smiled. Not the friendly sort of smile one neighbor might give another, but the kind that felt like a private joke told at your expense. Marissa went back inside, closing the door more firmly than she intended. It wasn't in her nature to overreact, but something about the way Karen lingered near that land, the way she seemed to be orchestrating some quiet operation, told Marissa that this wasn't just idle neighborly tinkering. She didn't know what was coming, but she could feel the edges of her safe, quiet life beginning to shift, as though the ground itself was preparing to tilt beneath her feet. The first real sign that something was wrong came the following Saturday just after sunset, when Marissa was in her kitchen rinsing vegetables for dinner and noticed an unusual orange flicker against the wall. At first she thought it was just the reflection of a car's taillights passing by. But when the flicker didn't fade and instead grew brighter, she set down the knife and stepped toward the back window. What she saw made her breath catch. In the narrow strip of land behind her fence, right up against the property line, a towering bonfire had been lit. The pile of pallets and scrap lumber she had been quietly keeping track of for weeks was now engulfed in flames. The fire roaring and snapping as it climbed higher, embers spiraling into the air and drifting toward her yard. Shadows danced across her garden, and she could feel the heat even through the glass. Standing beside the inferno were half a dozen people. Some she recognized vaguely from the neighborhood, others she didn't know at all. At the center of it, orchestrating the chaos with animated gestures, was Karen Jones, her gray hair illuminated by the firelight, her clipboard tucked under one arm while she directed two men to add more fuel and make sure it really gets going. Marissa opened the back door and stepped outside, the warm night air thick with the smell of burning wood and something harsher, old paint or varnish, that made her throat tighten. "Karen!" she called, her voice raised to be heard over the crackle of the fire. Heads turned, but Karen didn't look startled. In fact, she smiled as though Marissa had just joined a friendly gathering. "Evening, Marissa," she called back, her tone bright and casual. "We're running a fire safety test for the community, making sure everyone knows what to do if there's an emergency. Your property's right here, so it's perfect for simulating a real-life scenario." The words hit Marissa as both absurd and alarming. There was nothing official about this. There were no fire department personnel, no safety gear, no designated boundaries, just a roaring blaze within dangerous proximity to her wooden fence, her shed, and her home. She took a step closer to the fence, trying to keep her voice steady. "This isn't safe. You can't do that here. You're going to set something on fire." Karen's expression didn't change. If anything, the smile tightened. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. We've got it under control. Besides, this is on the community's land, not yours. You don't get to tell us what to do here." One of the men chuckled, tossing another pallet onto the flames, sending up a fresh wave of sparks that scattered over Marissa's vegetable beds. The surge of heat made her skin prickle. She turned back toward the house, already reaching for her phone. Her instinct was not to argue further, not to escalate the confrontation herself. Instead, she dialed the non-emergency fire department line, explained the situation in clipped but precise terms, and gave the address. The dispatcher's tone shifted as soon as she heard large bonfire and within a few feet of wooden structures. The woman on the line told Marissa to stay indoors if she felt unsafe and assured her that a crew was on the way. Marissa hung up and shut her back door firmly, locking it before drawing the blinds, but she stayed by the window, watching. It was only a few minutes before the distant wail of sirens cut through the hum of the neighborhood. Karen's group didn't scatter at the sound. Instead, they lingered, as if confident they could justify what they were doing. When the fire truck pulled up and firefighters stepped out in full gear, the scene took on a surreal edge. One of the firefighters strode toward the blaze, speaking firmly to Karen, while another began unrolling a hose. Karen gestured animatedly toward Marissa's house, and though Marissa couldn't hear the words over the sound of water blasting from the hose, she saw the way Karen's eyes narrowed, her arm sweeping in a way that made it clear she was pointing out her as the source of interference. The firefighters doused the fire methodically, steam and smoke billowing into the night, until all that remained was a smoldering, blackened heap. As the crew packed up, one firefighter broke off and approached Marissa's back gate. She stepped outside to meet him, the smell of smoke clinging to her clothes. He introduced himself, took her brief statement, and confirmed what she already knew, that the bonfire had been dangerously close to causing a serious incident and violated multiple local safety codes. He said it would be documented, though he stopped short of telling her what, if anything, would be done about those responsible. Marissa thanked him, but as he walked away, she could feel Karen's gaze fixed on her from the other side of the fence, sharp and unblinking in the dim light. When she woke the next morning, there was an envelope wedged into her front door frame. It was unmarked except for her name in blocky handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. "Next time, Don't get in the way. It's not your land. No signature, no pretense of civility. Just a thinly veiled threat. She read it twice, then set it down on the counter, her stomach tightening. The smell of smoke still lingered faintly in her home, a reminder of how close the fire had come. It was clear now that what happened the night before wasn't a misguided community exercise. It was deliberate, and it was personal. The morning after the bonfire, Marissa tried to push the unease out of her mind by throwing herself into her usual routines, tending to her garden and cleaning the kitchen. But she couldn't shake the image of Karen's smile in the firelight or the blunt words on the anonymous note left in her door. By mid-afternoon, she noticed something else that made her pulse quicken. Her mailbox, which had been closed and locked the night before, was hanging slightly ajar. She walked over and found that most of her usual mail was there. Bills, a magazine, but an envelope from her insurance company was torn open along the top, as if someone had thumbed through it. There was no letter inside. Marissa stood there for a long moment, scanning the street, but there was no one in sight. She carefully took the envelope inside and placed it in a drawer. She wasn't about to throw away something that might become relevant later. That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the neighborhood, she heard the low rumble of voices near the back fence. Moving quietly, she stepped to the side of the yard where the trellis partially blocked the view and saw Karen with two men she didn't recognize. One was pointing toward Marissa's shed, making a wide gesture, while Karen nodded. She couldn't hear the words, but the way they glanced at her house and then toward the strip of land behind the fence made the meaning clear. They were discussing her property. After a few minutes, they walked away, but the sight left her unsettled enough that she decided to take a step she normally would have avoided. She called the local police station's non-emergency number, explained that there had been a threatening incident with a large fire on community land near her home, and asked whether she could file a formal report about the note she'd received and the suspicious activity near her property line. The officer she spoke with was calm but attentive, and by the end of the call, he told her he'd send someone by to take down the details. When the patrol car arrived just after dusk, Marissa gave the officer, a young man with a patient demeanor, a clear, factual account of the bonfire, the fire department's involvement, the note, and her concerns about possible retaliation. She showed him the envelope and the torn insurance mail, and he wrote everything down in a small notebook. He told her that while it wasn't yet enough to open a formal criminal investigation, having a report on file could help if things escalated. His advice was measured. Keep records of every interaction, don't confront anyone directly, and call immediately if she saw another fire or any trespassing. He also suggested she consider adding lighting or security cameras facing the back fence. The next morning, she took that advice seriously. A local handyman came by in the afternoon and installed 2 motion-activated floodlights along the rear of her property, angled so they would bathe the fence line in light at the slightest movement. It gave her a small measure of comfort, though she knew it wouldn't stop someone determined. Later that week, she noticed that the charred remains of the bonfire had been cleared away from the strip of land, replaced by a freshly stacked pile of new pallets and cut logs. This time, they were arranged more neatly, almost like a supply waiting for a scheduled event. It was obvious the so-called fire safety test wasn't a one-time stunt. On Friday, while Marissa was trimming her hydrangeas, Karen approached from the sidewalk, her tone falsely sweet as she called out, "Marissa, I hope you're not still upset about the other night. We're planning another drill soon. Bigger, better, more authentic. It's really for everyone's benefit, you know." Marissa didn't rise to the bait. She simply replied that any such activity near her property would be reported immediately to the fire department and the police. Karen's smile faltered for just a moment before she turned and walked away, muttering something under her breath. That evening, just after dark, the new floodlights blazed on, triggered by movement at the back fence. Marissa hurried to the window and saw 2 figures crouched near the ground, one of them holding what looked like a gas can. The other was stacking kindling against the far corner of the fence, in the narrow gap where the boards were older and slightly warped. The lights caught them in full view, and after a split-second pause they grabbed their things and ran into the shadows. Marissa's hands shook as she dialed the police, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. When the same officer from earlier in the week arrived, he inspected the area and found several small bundles of wood wrapped with twine, each positioned along the fence in a way that suggested they were meant to ignite quickly. He took photographs, collected the bundles as evidence, and told Marissa that he was now categorizing this as a potential case of attempted property damage. He didn't name anyone, but she could tell from his tone that he suspected the same person she did. By the time the patrol car pulled away, the neighborhood had gone quiet again, but the sense of violation lingered. Marissa locked every door and window, made a pot of tea she barely drank, and sat in the living room with the lights off, listening to the faint hum of the new floodlights outside. She knew one thing with absolute clarity. The fire itself had been dangerous, but it was only the opening move. Whatever Karen's endgame was, she had no intention of stopping after one failed attempt. The tension had shifted from a simmer to a slow, deliberate burn, and Marissa understood now that if she wanted to keep her home safe, she would have to be ready for the next strike, whenever and however it came. By the following week, the memory of the attempted kindling placement at her fence had hardened into something colder and more deliberate inside Marissa. It was no longer about a one-off conflict or even a neighbor's overstepping. It was about calculated intimidation, and she had no illusions that it would fade on its own. She had followed the officer's advice to the letter, documenting every occurrence with dates, times, photographs, and descriptions. Yet she also understood that documentation alone would not stop a determined person who believed she could operate without consequences. The first truly unexpected development came on a Wednesday morning when she received a voicemail from the local fire inspector, a man she had met briefly during the initial Bonfire incident. His tone was measured but unmistakably serious. He wanted to schedule a visit to her property to review concerns raised in a recent safety complaint. The words landed with a dull weight in her stomach because she hadn't raised any new complaints, and she could guess with uncomfortable certainty who had. When the inspector arrived that afternoon, he was professional but clearly uncomfortable, explaining that he had been contacted by a member of the community who alleged that Marissa's shed was a fire hazard due to excessive storage of flammable materials. She led him to the shed, unlocked it, and stood by while he inspected the neatly organized shelves of gardening tools, a few sealed containers of paint from years earlier, and a single gas can stored well away from anything combustible. He took notes, looked at her, and said plainly that nothing here constituted a hazard. He would file the report accordingly, but she should be aware that multiple similar complaints in a short period could trigger mandatory inspections. The subtext was clear. Someone was trying to create a paper trail against her. That evening, determined not to sit passively while this pattern of provocation unfolded, Marissa contacted the fire inspector's office again and asked whether she could obtain copies of all complaints filed against her property over the past 6 months. It took 2 days for the documents to arrive by email, and when they did, she was unsurprised to see that 3 separate complaints had been lodged in the last 2 weeks alone. 2 about the shed, 1 about uncontrolled vegetation along the back fence. None had resulted in violations, but each bore the same handwritten witness statement, signed by Karen Jones. Seeing the repetition in black and white crystallized something in Marissa's mind. Karen was not improvising. She was executing a campaign. The next escalation came swiftly. On Saturday morning, Marissa was pulling weeds near the back corner of her property when she noticed tire tracks cutting through the grass of the narrow strip behind her fence, the grooves still damp from the night's rain. Following them with her eyes, she saw they led to a fresh stack of timber placed roughly where the last bonfire had been. Only this time, the pile was larger, the logs thicker, and scattered among them were flattened cardboard boxes and what looked like rolls of fabric or insulation. The arrangement was too organized to be casual dumping, and the presence of highly flammable materials made her skin prickle. She called the fire department's non-emergency line again, explaining what she saw and emphasizing her concern given the prior incident. This time, the responding crew took photographs and advised her to speak directly with the precinct's community liaison officer, someone who specialized in recurring neighborhood disputes that edged into criminal territory. When she met with him the following Monday, she was struck by his pragmatic approach. He listened without rushing, asked for copies of her photo records and the complaint forms, and then said, "You don't have to solve this yourself, but you do need to keep tightening the net. We'll keep responding, and if there's a clear act that crosses the line, it's going on the record as criminal mischief or attempted arson." That same afternoon, while she was inside sorting the documents she planned to hand over, the motion, floodlights at the back, flared again. She glanced out to see two teenagers she didn't recognize tossing small bundles of dry sticks into the pile of timber, laughing as they did. They bolted when the lights came on, but what unsettled Marissa was the way they glanced toward Karen's house as they ran, as if expecting approval. Whether Karen had sent them or they were simply emboldened by her, the effect was the same. It was a performance of dominance, carried out in plain view of the person they wanted to rattle. The breaking point came 2 days later. Marissa returned from the grocery store to find a bright yellow notice taped to her front door, stamped with the words, "Final Warning." It was from the local code enforcement office, stating that failure to address documented hazards on her property could lead to fines. The listed hazard was the alleged overgrowth along her back fence, overgrowth that didn't exist as the fence line had been trimmed neatly a week earlier. She called the office immediately, and after some persistence was able to speak with the officer whose signature was on the notice. He admitted that he hadn't personally inspected the property. The notice was issued based on a community representative's statement and photographs. When she asked for the photographs, he hesitated, then said they had already been uploaded to the public record and she could request them through the city's online portal. That night, when she finally accessed them, her jaw tightened. The images showed her fence line thick with weeds and brush, but the timestamp embedded in the corner was from 3 years earlier, long before she had even moved in. She didn't call Karen. She didn't march down the street to confront her. Instead, she printed the photographs, highlighted the date, and added them to the growing binder of evidence she kept on her dining table. She understood now that this was a war of attrition, designed to drain her time, energy, and credibility until she either gave up or made a misstep that could be used against her. And in that understanding, a new clarity formed. Karen's methods relied on escalation without direct exposure. If Marissa could hold her ground without giving her an opening, the attacks might become reckless enough to break through that veil of deniability. She didn't know when or how the next move would come, but she was certain it would, and when it did, she intended to be ready, not with anger, but with precision. 3 days passed without any new incidents, but Marissa knew better than to believe the silence was a sign of retreat. In conflicts like this, lulls often meant that the next move was being prepared. On the 4th evening, just after 9, the motion floodlights flared to life, and when she glanced out the back window she saw not a person, but the unmistakable glow of fire. Her heart lurched as she ran to the patio door. There, on the same strip of land that had been the site of the first bonfire, a fresh blaze was building, smaller than before but positioned deliberately closer to her fence, and feeding it were tightly bundled sections of dry pine branches and strips of fabric that flared bright and hot. She grabbed her phone, calling the fire department without hesitation, her voice steady as she relayed the details and emphasized the proximity to her home. The dispatcher's tone shifted immediately to urgency, and within minutes the distant wail of sirens carried through the night. While she waited, Marissa stood inside with the lights off, watching. 2 figures were visible in the firelight, one tall, one shorter, both wearing dark hooded sweatshirts, and she could hear their muffled conversation, punctuated by occasional laughter. The taller one crouched to prod the fire with a length of wood, sending up a fresh spray of sparks, while the shorter paced along the fence line as if inspecting it. When the fire truck's headlights finally cut across the scene, the pair scattered into the shadows, slipping away through the narrow path that led toward the street behind Karen's house. The firefighters moved quickly, dousing the flames and soaking the surrounding ground until only wet ash remained. One of them approached her door to confirm the report and take a brief statement, noting that this was the second fire in the same location in less than a month and that it would be documented as a repeat incident. The next morning, before she had even made her coffee, there was a knock at her door. A uniformed police officer stood there, holding a clipboard, and explained that he had been sent to follow up on the previous night's fire. His questions were direct. Had she recognized the individuals? Had there been any prior threats? Had she noticed anyone near her property earlier in the evening? Marissa answered carefully, recounting the history without naming Karen outright, but making it clear that the events were part of a larger pattern of targeted behavior. The officer wrote steadily, occasionally glancing toward the back of the house, and when he finished he advised her to consider filing for a restraining order if she could connect the harassment to a specific individual. It was not advice she took lightly, but she also understood the difficulty of proving direct involvement without catching someone in the act. That same afternoon, she took a step toward making that proof possible. She called a local security company and arranged for the installation of 2 high-resolution cameras, one mounted above the back patio to cover the fence line, and another placed discreetly in a corner of the yard to catch the side angle. The technician, a middle-aged man with a quiet efficiency, walked her through the system's capabilities: motion-triggered recording, night vision, automatic backups to cloud storage, and reassured her that even if the cameras were damaged, the footage would already be saved off-site. When he left, she felt a small but significant shift in her sense of control. For the first time since the conflict began, she had a tool that might turn the tide of evidence in her favor. 2 nights later, the system paid for itself. At 2:13 a.m., the motion alert buzzed on her phone, waking her from a shallow sleep. She opened the live feed and saw a lone figure at the back fence, the hood down this time, revealing Karen's unmistakable silver hair catching the faint light. Karen was leaning over the fence, shaking a small container and sprinkling what looked like a granular substance along the base of the boards, moving methodically from one end to the other. Marissa's mind ran through possibilities. Accelerant, pesticide, something meant to damage the wood. But she didn't waste time speculating. She dialed the non-emergency police line, explained that she had live footage of someone trespassing at her property boundary and applying an unknown substance, and waited while they dispatched a patrol unit. By the time the officers arrived, Karen was gone, but the residue she had left was still visible on the damp soil. One officer photographed it while the other collected a small sample in a plastic evidence bag, telling Marissa it would be sent for analysis. Neither officer commented on the identity of the person in the video, but one of them asked if she would be willing to provide a copy of the footage, which she immediately did, emailing the clip from her phone to the station's secure address. The officer's expression was neutral, but she caught the flicker of recognition when Karen's face appeared in the frame. The following day was quiet, almost oppressively so, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Marissa went about her tasks, hyper-aware of every sound from the street, every shadow that shifted across her yard. She knew the analysis of the residue and the review of the footage would take time, but for the first time she felt the balance of the situation beginning to change. This was no longer just her word against Karen's. There was now a tangible piece of evidence, recorded and collected, that placed her at the scene in the act of doing something she would have to explain. And Marissa intended to make sure that when the moment came, there would be no plausible explanation that could strip away the truth. The call from the police came late on a Thursday afternoon, just as the sky was turning the heavy shade of gray that promised rain. The officer on the line spoke with the same measured tone he had used before, but there was a subtle shift in his delivery this time, a weight behind the words. The substance Karen had been recorded sprinkling along Marissa's fence tested positive for a chemical fire accelerant, the kind sold in hardware stores for starting large outdoor burns. It was, he explained, not illegal to possess, but applying it to someone else's property without permission was a different matter entirely. Combined with the video evidence, it was enough to justify a warrant for further investigation. Marissa listened carefully, feeling the strange duality of relief and apprehension settle over her. Relief that the threat was finally recognized for what it was, apprehension at the inevitable backlash once Karen realized she was cornered. The officers asked her to remain at home that evening in case they needed her to identify anything, and shortly after dusk, the quiet of the street was broken by the sudden arrival of 2 patrol cars and an unmarked vehicle pulling up in front of Karen's house. From her kitchen window, Marissa could see the officers approach the door, one of them holding a folder that she guessed contained the warrant. She couldn't hear what was said, but she saw the moment Karen opened the door, her expression shifting rapidly from feigned surprise to sharp, clipped protest. The exchange grew animated, and eventually, one of the officers gestured firmly toward the driveway while another disappeared into the house. It was during that tense half-hour that Marissa's phone buzzed again. This time it was a live alert from her security system. The rear camera had picked up movement near the timber pile on the community strip. She opened the feed to see 2 younger men, both with bandanas covering their faces, dousing the pile with liquid from a red plastic container. The image was lit only by the faint spill from her floodlights, but the intent was unmistakable. Her pulse quickened as she realized that this was the counterstrike. Whether it was meant to destroy evidence, create chaos, or intimidate her, the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. She called the fire department before the match was even struck, giving the location and describing exactly what she saw. As she stayed on the line, one of the men flicked a lighter, and in a sudden roar, the pile went up in a wall of orange flame, the wind carrying sparks directly toward her fence. She stepped back from the window, her voice steady but urgent as she relayed the escalation to the dispatcher. Within minutes, the sirens were back, louder than she had ever heard them in the quiet street, and the glow from the fire was cut through by the white flash of headlights and the harsh beams of emergency spotlights. From the back of the house, she watched the firefighters work with swift precision, soaking the blaze from multiple angles while 2 police officers moved in on the arsonists, who had tried to flee but were slowed by the mud and the confusion of the scene. It didn't take long before both were handcuffed and led toward the waiting patrol car. When one of the officers passed close enough for her to hear, he confirmed what she had already suspected. They were connected to Karen through a relative, and this would be added to the expanding file on her activities. By the time the fire was fully extinguished, Karen herself was being escorted from her house, her voice rising in shrill protests that carried down the street despite the distance. Marissa stood silently at her back window, watching as the woman who had spent months trying to unsettle her was guided firmly into the rear seat of the unmarked car. She didn't feel triumph exactly. It was something quieter, a deep exhale of tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding for weeks. The rain finally began to fall, soft at first, then harder, hissing against the wet ash where the fire had burned, washing the smoke from the air. She closed the blinds and sat at her dining table, the binder of documents and photographs still there like a testament to every step that had led to this moment. For the first time since it began, the house felt entirely her own again. Not just a place she lived, but a place she had defended with patience, precision, and the resolve to see the conflict through without letting it consume her. She knew there would be follow-up, court dates, and perhaps lingering resentment from some in the neighborhood, but the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Whatever came next, she would face it, knowing that the quiet she had fought to protect was no longer a fragile thing waiting to be taken. It was something she had earned. The following weeks moved with an unfamiliar stillness, the kind of quiet that felt earned rather than accidental. The charred remains of the last fire were cleared away by city workers within days, leaving behind only a patch of scorched earth on the community strip, a stark reminder of how close things had come to disaster. Karen's house stayed dark most evenings, her car gone for long stretches, and while Marissa heard fragments of gossip from neighbors about pending charges and restraining orders, she didn't go looking for details. Her focus was on restoring what had been disrupted, replanting the beds closest to the fence, having the shed professionally treated with a fire-resistant coating, and adding a dense row of evergreens along the back boundary to create a living barrier between her home and whatever might unfold beyond it. The security cameras stayed in place, not as a sign of fear, but as a quiet acknowledgement that vigilance was part of protecting her peace. From time to time, she caught sight of a few neighbors watching her from a distance, their expressions no longer tinged with suspicion, but with something closer to respect, perhaps even gratitude that someone had been willing to stand firm without, letting the situation dissolve into shouting matches or reckless retaliation. She accepted that not everyone would like her or understand her choices, but she had no interest in winning popularity, only in safeguarding her home. One afternoon, while she was kneeling in the garden with her gloves deep in the soil, a gentle breeze carried the scent of the blooming hydrangeas, and for the first time in months, the smell of smoke didn't linger beneath it. She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, and looked over the fence toward the empty strip of land. It was silent, unclaimed, just a patch of ground with no one pacing it, no piles of lumber or hidden intentions. She felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest, the understanding that peace wasn't something you stumbled upon by luck. It was something you fought for, preserved, and maintained, even when doing so meant standing alone. And in that moment, she knew she had no regrets.